Hello Anatomy, welcome to our second video in our video series for Chapter 4. If you remember, the first video that we had for Chapter 4 went through the types of body membranes and some specifics into your skin. In Part 2, we're going to talk about the appendages of the skin, things like glands, hair follicles, and nails, and also different disorders that can happen of the skin, things like infections and finally cancer. So skin appendages, again, like I just said, you have different kinds of cutaneous glands, sebaceous glands, and sweat glands. So if you remember back from previous chapter, exocrine glands are just what you call glands that have ducts, glands that have little like tubes that come off them, where their products are secreted. Endocrine glands, just in comparison, are ones that just directly give off their products into your bloodstream. We're going to go through your hair, we're going to go through hair follicles, and we're going to discuss nails also. So sebaceous glands, that's a fancy way of talking about oil glands. And sebum is the official word for oil. So sebaceous glands are producing oil mainly as a lubricant for your skin. It also helps keep your hair from drying out. It keeps your hair from becoming brittle. And the oil can also kill bacteria that are always living on the surface of your skin. Most of these have ducts that enter or that empty into hair follicles. So usually sebaceous glands exit, or their products exit into hair follicles, which might keep your hair oily. Sometimes they empty directly onto the skin surface, but usually they empty into hair follicles. And these glands are particularly activated at puberty. It's probably not shocking that your hair tends to get oilier once you go through puberty. That's because these sebaceous glands are activated at puberty. This picture shows, so there's a lot going on here. So here I have the shaft for a hair follicle. I guess his hair has recently been cut or plucked out because I don't see an actual hair. The hair is growing down here in the follicle, and surrounding the follicle are secretory cells for a sebaceous gland, and you can see there's a little duct, and these cells would be secreting the sebum directly into the hair follicle, and it would empty onto the skin at the base of the hair. Here you see another, or sort of a drawing of a hair follicle, a hair shaft, and there's a sebaceous gland right next to it. Sweat glands are also called sudiferous glands. These are glands, obviously, that produce sweat. These are distributed widely through the skin. I kind of see the word odor in this word, even though it's not really. Sweat glands are what, sweat is typically odorless, but bacteria that grow in sweat can be pretty stinky. So when you see sudiferous, I see the word odiferous or odor in here. You can remember that sweat glands are sudiferous and that oil glands are sebaceous. Kids get those confused a lot. So the two types of sudiferous glands are eccrine versus apocrine. Eccrine glands, basically they're producing sweat and they open directly onto a pore on your skin surface. And they're producing sweat, which again is a clear substance, which we'll talk about on an upcoming slide. Excuse me, something's in my throat. Apocrine glands are a kind of sweat gland that empty directly into hair follicles. And these, again, function beginning at puberty, which is why you tend to get particularly sweaty in places where you have hair. These glands also produce fatty acids and proteins, which can give sweat kind of a milky or yellowish color from apocrine glands. I can't talk today. This picture, we saw this slide previously talking about sebaceous glands. Eccrine glands, if you look at this diagram, you see how they're opening directly onto a pore, not into a hair follicle. If this picture had the apocrine glands, they would be emptying into a hair follicle. Here I see a cross section of eccrine glands. See the little secretory cells. So sweat and its function. So sweat's mostly water. It also could contain some salts and some vitamin C. Sometimes you get different metabolic wastes like uric acid. And remember, apocrine glands also produce fatty acids and some proteins in their secretions too. So the function of sweat, this is not surprising. It helps cool you down. When sweat evaporates off your skin, it takes a lot of heat away from your skin, so it dissipates excess heat. Sweat also contains some waste products, like we mentioned earlier. Sweat has a typical pH of around 4 or 5. So sweat is acidic, which helps to inhibit bacterial growth. The odor, if sweat is stinky, it's because of bacteria growing in the sweat. Bacteria, the fatty acid and protein secretions in sweat, bacteria love that. It's like lunchtime at the buffet for bacteria, and it's their growth that makes sweat smell bad, which is why oftentimes antiperspirants will contain some kind of antibacterial. An antiperspirant stops you from perspiring. If it has an antibacterial, it's also killing bacteria. So hair, we're not going to get into hair that much. Hair is, again, produced in a hair follicle. Hair cells themselves are basically epithelial cells, like in your skin, but that are very highly keratinized to make them sort of hard and firm. At the base of the hair follicle, there'll be melanocytes, which give hair the pigment, which gives hair its color. And basically, in the bottom of a hair follicle, I'll show you this in a minute, the hair originates from the stratum basale, like we saw back in the first video. So here I have a cross section of a hair follicle. Here you can see this is the dermis, this is the epidermis, and basically you see where the hair is growing in what's called the matrix. That's where the hair is actively growing and the cells get pushed upward. Here you have melanocytes that help give the hair its color. Underneath is going to be that subcutaneous hypodermis, that fatty sort of bordering layer underneath your skin. One thing to point out is oftentimes hair follicles have these thin little sheets of smooth muscle called erector pili. And basically, if you get, if you get cold and you get goosebumps, that's when erector pili, which can be on both sides of the hair follicle, tighten, and it causes the hair follicle to kind of pinch upward, which is what we call goosebumps. This picture is kind of cool. So this is a hair, here's the follicle. The hair is growing out sort of at you. And you can see the outer layer of the hair shaft are sort of flattened epidermal cells, kind of like flattened tiles. Hair that's unhealthy, hair that has split ends, you can see kind of gets jagged and sort of unhealthy looking. Hair that's particularly healthy has sort of a smooth appearance on the shaft. So nails, let me show you a picture of this and I'll come back to this slide. So in this slide, you can see part of the nail, which is called the root, is sort of under the skin, and the body of the nail is exposed to the outside. The layer of cells that's underneath the nail, again, is stratum basale, like we saw in a previous video. And here you can see the bony tip of your fingers. So nails are, again, basically highly keratinized cells of your epidermis. They don't have pigment, which is why they're colorless. There really aren't melanocytes in nail beds. And again, it's the stratum basale, which is underneath the nail bed, which is responsible for growth. So going through some disorders of the skin. So burns can be very, very serious. So, burns can be caused by heat from electricity. You can get electrical burns, UV radiation, like a sunburn. You can get chemical burns. The main risk of burns, long-term, a burn's gonna depress your immune system. It's gonna obviously lead to infection. The initial damage of burns, though, is dehydration. You can lose a lot of water through your skin, especially if your skin is burned. Electrolyte imbalance would be if your blood chemistry, the blood salts and blood electrolytes of your blood gets imbalanced. And so circulatory shock would be if you lose a lot of blood volume, if you lose a lot of water, you can go into shock, and you would need to replace that water very, very quickly, or you'll have worse issues. So the way that we sort of measure the extent of burns, we're going to do an activity on this probably in class. It's called the rule of nines, and this is a quick way to estimate the extent of which the body is burned. And basically, it divides the body into 11 areas. Each account for about 9% of the total body surface area. The last 1% is the genital area, so it adds up to 100. You can see the front of each leg is 9%, so the legs total, front and back, would be 36%. The arms front and back, each arm is 9%. The head front and back is 9%. We're going to practice this in class probably. What you would want to do is you would want to estimate the extent of the burns, and you would want to, this is just the same picture bigger, you would want to talk about the severity of the burns. So you've seen this before. So first-degree burns are things like sunburns. Only when the outer epidermis is damaged, the skin gets red and swollen. Give it a few days and it'll heal pretty well. Usually you don't get scarring. Second-degree burns are when you get blisters. This is when you have damage to the epidermis and the upper dermis. And if you have what looks like a first-degree burn, but you have blisters along with it, that's a second-degree burn. A third-degree burn would be when you burn the epidermis and the dermis beneath it. And if you destroy the dermis beneath it, you basically kill the nerve cells in the dermis too. So these burns are painless. You might not even realize you're getting the burn, which can be risky if you don't realize there's something going on. The skin can kind of be a gray, white, ashy look, or it can actually be black. Second-degree burns, blisters are pretty painful. First-degree burns are pretty painful too, if you ask me. Third-degree burns are painless. This picture shows here I have first-degree burns. Here I have a second-degree burn. You can see there's a blister there. There's some blisters here. A third-degree burn, you can see the skin kind of has this sort of whitish appearance because you burned it down to the dermis. There is a thing called a fourth-degree burn. Fourth-degree burn would be you burn down to like muscle tissue or bone. In that case, oftentimes you might have to amputate an appendage if the damage is that serious. So other infections, so athlete's foot is a pretty common fungal infection. Boils and carbuncles. Boils are basically a bacterial infection, usually at a hair follicle. If a hair follicle gets infected, usually you get these on like your neck or on your hands maybe. And they fill with pus and eventually they drain. They're not particularly pleasant to talk about boils and carbuncles. Cold sores are caused by a form of the herpes virus. Typically, if you have cold sores, you have the herpes virus for the rest of your life. But the cold sores flare up during times when you're sick from something else, or maybe you're stressed, or you're under some kind of immunopressure. Like I said, maybe you're sick with something else. Contact dermatitis, this would be like something like poison ivy where you have an allergic reaction to something. Impetigo, this picture here, this is caused by a bacterial infection. Impetigo is particularly common in young kids, like kids who might be in daycare or in elementary school where they're in contact with a bunch of kids. They might get impetigo. Psoriasis is a condition, you can see the dry, flaky skin. What causes it oftentimes is not known. Typically, it is an autoimmune condition where your immune system is attacking your skin, which is not something that you would usually want to have happen. Again, cold sores, impetigo, psoriasis. Oh, those lovely pictures. So we're going to end with cancer. So we'll talk more about cancer later, but basically any kind of cancer, when a cell becomes cancerous, it's because the cell is going through cell division uncontrollably. When the cell cycle sort of spun out of control and you get an abnormal mass of cells called a tumor that are growing and dividing too quickly. Two kinds of cancer. So a benign tumor is one where the cancer has not spread, only the cells, or the cancer is limited to the cells of the tumor. A malignant cancer is when the cancer has metastasized, which is a fancy word for moved, go to other parts of the body. This obviously is worse. Typically, cells of your body don't leave where they are. Like cells of my liver don't just leave my liver. Cancer cells do. If I have a tumor in my liver, one of those cells could leave my liver and go to my brain, and now suddenly I have a tumor in my brain also. Cancer is obviously much more dangerous when it's spread to other parts of your body. Skin cancer is the most common type of cancer. So some of the more common types of skin cancer. So basal cell carcinoma. This is the most common type of skin cancer. These are the least malignant. This is when cells of the stratum basale, the lower layer of your epidermis, become cancerous. They kind of grow into a mass that gets pushed upward. Usually they're called early. Usually you have it excised, you have it removed, and then very likely that you're fine. By far, most basal cell carcinomas result in being cured 100%. Squamous cell carcinoma, these can be more dangerous. These do metastasize. Oftentimes, cancer cells, when they spread, they first infect lymph nodes. And if cancer gets into a lymph node, it could potentially go to other parts of your body. So usually when you have these removed, you might remove the lymphatic tissue that's around it. If you catch it early and remove it early, you're likely going to be okay. These arise from cells in the stratum spinosum, one of the layers above the stratum basale, and these oftentimes are induced or caused by sunburns. Malignant melanoma, these are very, very dangerous. This is a cancer of the melanocytes, the cells that give you pigment. These can be very, very deadly. They metastasize to lymphatic tissue and blood vessels, very, very common. Usually you use what's called the ABCD rule to diagnose melanomas. The letters stand for, so basically you use the ABCD rule to sort of analyze moles or other markings on your skin. So a mole that's asymmetrical, as in maybe it's not like a perfectly symmetrical mole, or the coloration varies. B is border irregularity, where the borders are not smooth, they could be rough. C stands for color. We kind of discussed this one with A. If the mole changes colors in different areas. And D is for diameter. If a mole is larger than 6 millimeters in diameter, that's a cause for concern. Really, any of these is bad. If you have a combination of them, you would definitely want to have that mole checked out by a doctor. Okay, that's the end of video 2. That's the end of chapter 4. I hope that was helpful, and I will see you guys next time.